At the quiet edge of a town that had long since turned its back on him, Arthur lived in a house that was slowly surrendering to time. He was 84 years old, a man made of brittle memories and the quiet ache of solitude. The paint on his small home peeled like sunburnt skin, the garden had gone wild with weeds that choked out the last of his wife's roses, and the fence was more suggestion than barrier. It sagged in weary sighs, its posts loose in the damp earth. This fence was the perfect metaphor for Arthur's life, a line drawn around a space no one was trying to cross. His children, grown and scattered by the winds of their own busy lives, called on holidays, their voices thin and distant through the telephone line, conversations filled with the polite, hollow questions of strangers. His neighbors offered curt nods if they saw him on the rare occasion he ventured out for supplies, their eyes sliding past him, seeing not a man but a landmark of decay. He was a ghost haunting the daylight, a story that everyone assumed had already ended. Then, one crisp autumn morning, as the sun cast long, melancholic shadows across his overgrown lawn, a new shadow appeared. It was immense, a shape of impossible bulk and stillness. At the broken slat in his gate stood a creature just as forgotten, just as discarded as he was. It was a bull. A massive charolais, its creamy white coat smudged with mud and marked with the faint scars of a life of service now deemed complete. A tarnished brass ring hung from its nose, a symbol of control that now seemed pointless. He had been condemned, judged too old, too stubborn, too much to be of any further use at the nearby farm. He was an ending, a loose thread about to be cut. The bull stood, with its head lowered, its dark, liquid eyes fixed on the old man who had shuffled onto his porch. For a long, silent moment, two souls marked for disposal faced each other across a collapsing fence. One was about to save the other. But no one, least of all Arthur, could have predicted which one it would be. The bull didn't move for hours. It simply stood, a silent, breathing monument to obsolescence. Arthur watched from his window, the worn fabric of the armchair, a familiar comfort against his thinning frame. He expected it to wander off, to find a richer pasture, to answer some instinct he couldn't comprehend. But it remained. The animal's stillness was not threatening. It was patient, resigned. It was a mirror. Arthur saw his own long, empty afternoons reflected in the creature's unblinking gaze. He saw the same quiet waiting for a conclusion that never seemed to arrive. By midday, a strange and unfamiliar impulse stirred within him. It was a flicker of responsibility, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his wife, Martha, had passed. He shuffled to the kitchen, his slippers whispering against the linoleum. He found a bucket, rinsed the dust from its interior, and filled it with water from the tap, the sound echoing in the silent house. His hands trembled as he carried it out, the water sloshing over the rim, cold against his wrinkled skin. The world outside the confines of his porch felt vast and uncertain. He approached the fence, his heart a soft, fluttering drum against his ribs. The bull watched him, its huge head tracking his slow, deliberate movements. There was no aggression, only a deep, unnerving curiosity. Arthur placed the bucket just inside the broken gate, a small offering across a vast divide. He retreated a few steps, his back finding the familiar support of a porch post. The bull waited until Arthur was still, then took a ponderous step forward. It lowered its massive head, its horns like polished ivory in the pale sunlight, and began to drink. The sound was deep and rhythmic, a life-affirming noise in the profound silence of Arthur's world. That was the first day. The next morning, it was still there. Arthur brought it another bucket of water, and, this time, an apple he'd found at the back of his refrigerator, its skin slightly wrinkled. He held it out on his flattened palm, a gesture he remembered from a childhood visit to a farm. The bull's wet, rough nose snuffled against his skin, its warm breath a startlingly intimate sensation. Its lips, surprisingly gentle, plucked the apple from his hand. And in that moment, something inside Arthur shifted. A tiny, rusted gear turned for the first time in years. He was no longer just waiting, he was tending to something. The bull, which the farmer had gruffly called Cain for his stubbornness, became his silent companion. Arthur started talking to him, At first, it was just murmurs about the weather. But soon, the words became a river, flowing out of him with decades of pent-up loneliness. He told the bull about Martha, about the way she used to hum while she gardened. He told him about his son's promotion in a city he'd never see, and his daughter's children, who knew him only as a voice on the phone. The bull would listen, its great head cocked, its tail occasionally flicking a fly. It was the most profound audience Arthur had had in a decade. He wasn't giving advice. He wasn't offering platitudes. He was simply present. And for a man who felt invisible, being seen, even by a rejected animal, felt like a miracle. The arrangement, this quiet covenant between man and beast, did not go unnoticed. The village of Oakhaven was small, and its sightlines were clear. Mrs. Gable from across the street, a woman whose curtains were in a constant state of surveillance, was the first to make a call. She spoke to the town clerk, her voice a cocktail of concern and complaint. "There's a bull," she'd said, "a massive one, in old Arthur's yard. It's not safe." The clerk, a man named Henderson who operated on the principle of minimizing paperwork, sighed and promised to look into it. Soon, a car would cruise slowly past Arthur's house. A driver would crane his neck, see the placid giant placidly chewing its cud near the porch, and drive on, puzzled but not yet alarmed. The story became a piece of local curiosity, a topic of conversation over coffee at the town's only diner. "Did you hear about old man Arthur and his pet bull?" they'd ask, a note of ridicule in their voices. They saw it as the final, sad eccentricity of a man who had lost his grip. They saw liability, a farm animal, out of place, a ticking time bomb of potential lawsuits and property damage. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the way Arthur's shoulders had straightened. They didn't see the new purpose in his shuffling gait as he made his way to the feed store, buying a bag of sweet grain with the pension money he usually let accumulate. They didn't see the way he'd started clearing the weeds from around the porch, creating a small, tidy space for him and the bull, whom he had decided to rename Abel. It was a quiet act of redemption, a renaming of something the world had cast aside as worthless. The fence between them was becoming less of a barrier and more of a meeting point. Arthur would spend hours sitting on his porch steps, while Abel lay in the grass just on the other side, their shared silence a comfortable blanket against the world's noise. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, one of those sudden, violent squalls that rattled the old farmhouse to its bones. A fierce gust of wind ripped a loose shutter from an upstairs window, sending it crashing down onto the porch roof with a sound like a gunshot. Arthur, startled from a light doze, stumbled, his frail legs giving way. He fell hard against the porch railing, the brittle wood groaning in protest. In that split second, Abel was on his feet. With a speed that defied his bulk, he surged forward, not with aggression, but with a focused intensity. He slammed his broad head against the sagging gate, splintering the rotten wood and forcing his way into the yard. He didn't charge Arthur. He planted himself beside the trembling old man, his massive body a living shield, his head raised, scanning the property for the source of the threat. He let out a low, rumbling bellow, not of anger, but of warning. It was a sound that said, "I am here. He is not alone." From her window, Mrs. Gable saw the whole thing. She saw the fall. She saw the bull break through the fence, and she held her breath, expecting the worst. But what she saw instead was an act of unmistakable protection. She didn't call the clerk this time. She just watched, her hand over her mouth, as the giant animal stood guard over the frail old man until he had caught his breath and slowly pulled himself up. The story she told at the diner the next day had a different tone. The ridicule was gone, replaced by a note of bewildered awe. The incident with the falling shutter shifted the village's perception from mockery to wary concern. The bull was no longer just a strange pet. It was a powerful, unpredictable force. Henderson, the town clerk, could no longer ignore the situation. The original owner, a gruff farmer named Silas, who ran the large commercial operation on the other side of the valley, was contacted. Silas drove his dusty pickup truck to Arthur's house, his face a mask of annoyed impatience. He'd sold the bull for slaughter. He'd washed his hands of it. The fact that it had escaped and found its way here was a nuisance. He saw Arthur standing on the porch, Abel a few feet behind him, a silent, formidable guardian. "That's my animal," Silas said, not bothering with pleasantries. His voice was gravelly, used to commanding, not conversing. "He's a cull, destructive. I'm here to take him back. He's got an appointment to keep." The finality in his tone sent a chill through Arthur. An appointment. A cold, sterile word for an execution. Arthur, who had spent years receding, fading into the background, felt a different kind of energy surge through him. It was the fierce, protective fire he thought had been extinguished long ago. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmoving as Abel himself. "He's not bothering anyone. He's with me now," Silas scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "With you? He's a 1,000-pound bull, not a lapdog. He's dangerous. Henderson's got complaints. Now step aside, old man." But Arthur didn't step aside. He took a step forward. He stood directly between Silas and Abel, his small, frail body a ridiculously inadequate shield against the farmer's blustering anger. "His name is Abel," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. "And he is not dangerous. He is gentle. He is my friend." The word friend hung in the air, audacious and absurd to Silas, but profoundly true to Arthur. It was a declaration. Have you ever had to fight for something everyone else told you was worthless? Have you ever found a treasure in something the world had thrown away, and felt that protective fire burn in your soul? For Arthur, this wasn't about a bull anymore. It was about refusing to let one more good thing be discarded. It was about refusing to be silent. Silas, unaccustomed to being defied, especially by someone like Arthur, grew red in the face. "This is ridiculous. I'm getting a trailer. I'll have the sheriff with me if I have to. That animal is coming with me." He turned and stomped back to his truck, slamming the door with a finality that echoed across the quiet yard. Arthur watched him go, his heart pounding. He felt a gentle nudge at his back. He turned to see Abel's massive head right behind him, his dark eyes soft and questioning. Arthur reached up and laid a trembling hand on the bull's broad face. "It's all right, boy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the bull or himself. "I won't let him take you." The line had been drawn. The fight for Abel's life had begun, and in doing so, the fight for Arthur's own relevance in the world had too. The threat of Silas's return cast a long, dark shadow over the next few days. Arthur felt a gnawing anxiety he hadn't experienced in years. Sleep offered little respite, filled with dreams of trailers and ropes and the final, lonely gaze of his friend. But the fear did not paralyze him. It galvanized him. The man who had passively watched his own life wither away was now a man with a mission. He spent the daylight hours fortifying his property, a task that seemed both Herculean and hopeless. He gathered the fallen slats of the old fence, his gnarled hands struggling with the hammer and nails. Each swing was an effort, sending a jarring vibration up his arm, but he persisted. He wasn't just rebuilding a fence, he was building a sanctuary. He was declaring this small patch of forgotten land as a place of refuge. The villagers watched this transformation with a growing sense of astonishment. This wasn't the senile old man they had imagined. This was a man of fierce, quiet determination. The story of his standoff with Silas had spread, colored with the awe from Mrs. Gable's account of the storm. The narrative was changing. He wasn't a crazy old coot. He was a protector. A few people started to see the parallels. They saw a man the world had deemed expired, fighting for an animal the world had deemed worthless. One afternoon, as Arthur struggled to lift a heavy new post into place, a car pulled up. It was David, the young man who ran the local hardware store. He got out, a toolbox in his hand. "Heard you were doing some repairs, Arthur," he said, his tone gentle. "Thought you might need an extra set of hands." Arthur was speechless. He hadn't had a visitor, a real visitor who came to help, in over a decade. He could only nod, his throat thick with emotion. David didn't ask about the bull. He didn't question the sanity of the project. He just picked up a post-hole digger and began to work. the rhythmic thud of steel on earth a comforting percussion. Within the hour, another truck pulled up. It was Mr. Henderson, the town clerk. He got out, looking awkward and out of place in his collared shirt. He held a coil of pristine wire fencing. "Town ordinance," he said, clearing his throat gruffly. "Properties must be securely fenced if they house livestock. Just making sure you're up to code." It was a bureaucratic excuse, a thin veil for an act of kindness he didn't know how to express otherwise. Arthur looked from David, who was wiping sweat from his brow, to Henderson, who was pretending to inspect the property lines. And he understood. They weren't just helping him build a fence. They were choosing a side. They were standing with him. Abel watched the proceedings from the center of the yard, a calm anchor in a sea of activity. He seemed to understand the significance of the work, the way these men were weaving a barrier of protection around him and his human. By the end of the day, a small section of the fence was new and strong, its posts straight and its wire taut. It was a testament not just to Arthur's resolve, but to a community's slowly awakening conscience. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Arthur stood beside David, looking at their handiwork. "Thank you," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. David just clapped him on the shoulder. "Any friend of Abel's," he said with a small smile, "is a friend of ours." The new fence was more than wood and wire. It was a symbol. It was a line drawn in the dirt, not of exclusion, but of inclusion. It declared that what was inside this boundary was valued, was worth protecting. The news of the fence-raising bee, as it came to be called, rippled through Oakhaven. It became the catalyst that turned passive observation into active participation. The next day, it wasn't just David and Henderson. A retired carpenter showed up with a power saw, making quick work of the remaining posts. Two teenage brothers, known more for their mischief than their charity, arrived and began clearing the tangled brush and overgrown weeds along the fence line, working with a silent, focused energy. Mrs. Gable, the original complainant, walked across the street carrying a pitcher of iced tea and a plate of cookies, her face a mixture of apology and admiration. She placed them on the porch railing and looked at Arthur, her eyes communicating what words could not. She saw him now. She really saw him. The yard, once a symbol of Arthur's neglect, became a hub of quiet, purposeful activity. People came and went, each contributing a small part. They brought lumber. They offered labor. They shared stories. And at the center of it all was Abel, the unlikely catalyst. He would lie in the grass, watching the humans work, his presence a calming force. He was unafraid, unintimidated. It was as if he understood that these people were not a threat. They were his herd now, and Arthur's. Arthur moved among them like a conductor of a symphony he hadn't known he was composing. He pointed, he directed, he thanked them with a sincerity that resonated deeply. He was no longer the forgotten old man at the edge of town. He was Arthur. He had a name, a purpose, a friend who needed him, and now a community that was rediscovering him. Silas did return, just as he had threatened. He pulled up in his truck, a large stock trailer hitched to the back, but the scene he found was not the one he had expected. He saw a half-dozen townspeople working together, the sound of hammers and saws filling the air. He saw a strong, new fence rising from the ground. He saw Arthur standing proudly in the middle of it all, looking not frail, but formidable. Henderson walked over to Silas's truck, his official clipboard in hand. "Silas," he said, his voice firm, "we've had a look at the situation. Mr. Arthur has taken full legal responsibility for the animal. He's building a proper enclosure, as per town regulations. The animal is registered, vaccinated, and according to multiple witnesses, poses no threat." In fact, Henderson glanced over at Abel, who was now gently nudging a cookie from Mrs. Gable's outstretched hand. He seems to be something of a town asset. Silas was dumbfounded. The entire town had conspired against him, all for a useless old bull and a senile old man. He saw the resolute faces of his neighbors. He saw David, the hardware guy, lean on his shovel, his expression clear. He saw the teenage boys stop their work and stare at him, their loyalty unspoken but absolute. He was outnumbered. More than that, he was outmatched by a force he didn't understand: community. He muttered something under his breath, put his truck in reverse, and drove away, his empty trailer rattling behind him like a symbol of his defeat. A small, quiet cheer went up from the workers. Arthur felt a tear trace a path through the dust on his cheek. He walked over to Abel and wrapped his arms around the bull's thick neck as best he could. "We did it, boy," he whispered into the animal's warm, soft coat. "We did it. You're home." The victory over Silas was a turning point, not just for Arthur and Abel, but for Oakhaven itself. The shared project of building the fence had reawakened something dormant in the town's soul. It had reminded them of their connection to one another. The work on Arthur's property didn't stop once the fence was complete. It evolved. The teenage brothers, having cleared the fence line, decided the rest of the yard needed tending. They unearthed Martha's old rose bushes, pruned them, and were stunned when, weeks later, they began to produce fragrant, crimson blooms. Someone else noticed the peeling paint on the house and organized a small group to spend a Saturday scraping and applying a fresh coat of clean, white paint. The house began to look cherished, loved. Arthur's home was no longer a landmark of decay. It was becoming a beacon of renewal. People didn't just drop by to work anymore. They came to visit. They brought casseroles and pies, using the food as an excuse to spend a few minutes on the porch, sharing town gossip or simply sitting in the comfortable silence that Arthur and Abel had perfected. They would talk to Arthur, asking his opinions on things, listening to his stories of the town as it used to be. They discovered that the forgotten old man had a sharp mind, a dry wit, and a deep well of wisdom. They came to see Abel, too. The children were especially captivated. They would stand at the new, strong fence, their small hands gripping the wire, their eyes wide with wonder at the gentle giant. Arthur, with Abel calmly at his side, would tell them stories, letting them feed the bull sliced carrots from their palms. Abel, the bull once condemned as dangerous, became the town's most unconventional protector and its most beloved resident. He was a living lesson in judging by character, not reputation. The transformation was most profound in Arthur himself. The lonely, hunched-over man was gone. In his place stood a community elder, a man respected and cared for. The constant presence of neighbors had smoothed the sharpest edges of his grief for Martha. He smiled more, he laughed. The tremors in his hands seemed less pronounced when he was busy, when he had a purpose. He had found a second family in the most unexpected way. Have you ever witnessed something so profoundly good that it changes the very air a place breathes? That was what happened in Oakhaven. The spirit of connection that started in Arthur's yard began to spread. People started checking in on other elderly residents they hadn't spoken to in years. They organized a volunteer group to help with errands and home repairs for those who needed it. The Abel Project, as they unofficially called it, became a byword for looking out for one another. The fence that was built to keep one gentle soul safe had ended up breaking down the invisible fences that had separated an entire community. The change was so significant, it even reached the ears of those who had left. One bright Sunday afternoon, a car Arthur hadn't seen in years pulled into his newly tidied driveway. It was a late-model sedan, clean and unfamiliar, a world away from the dusty pickup trucks of his new friends. A man and a woman got out. It was his son Robert and his daughter Sarah. They stood for a moment, taking in the scene before them: the freshly painted house, the neat garden, the strong fence, and their father sitting on the porch, a massive white bull lying peacefully in the grass nearby. They had seen a story about Oakhaven's renewal project on a regional news website, a small human interest piece that had gone viral. They saw a picture of their father, looking happier and more vibrant than they had seen him in 20 years, standing next to a bull. The image was so incongruous, so startling, that they had driven 4 hours, compelled by a mixture of guilt, confusion, and a dawning sense of shame. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was hesitant, uncertain. Arthur looked up. He felt no surge of excitement, no desperate rush of joy. Instead, he felt a calm, steady peace. The frantic need for their attention, the hollow ache their absence used to cause, was gone. It had been filled by the low rumble of Abel's breathing, by the sound of David's hammer, by the taste of Mrs. Gable's cookies. "Robert, Sarah," he said, his voice even. What a surprise. They approached the porch, their city shoes looking out of place on the grass. They looked at Abel with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Dad, what is this? The news story. We didn't understand. Are you safe with this?" "This thing?" Robert asked, gesturing awkwardly at the bull. Before Arthur could answer, Abel lifted his head, gave a soft snort, and then laid his head back down with a gentle sigh, utterly unconcerned. The gesture spoke volumes. Arthur smiled. A genuine, easy smile. "His name is Abel. And yes, I'm safer than I've been in a long time." The conversation that followed was stilted, filled with the unspoken weight of years of neglect. They tried to explain their busy lives, the demands of their jobs, their own families. They apologized. It was clear they had come expecting to find their father in a state of pitiable decline, perhaps to make arrangements, to finally deal with the problem of his care. Instead, they found a man who was not a problem to be solved. They found a man who was the center of a thriving community, a man who had a life, a purpose, a friend. He didn't need rescuing. In a strange way, he had rescued himself, with the help of a bull and a town that had remembered how to care. They stayed for an hour, the conversation never quite finding its footing. When they left, they promised to call more, to visit again soon. Arthur believed they would. But as he watched their car disappear down the road, he felt no sadness, only a quiet sense of release. He turned to Abel and scratched the spot behind his massive ears. His family was bigger now. It wasn't just defined by blood, but by presence, by action, by love. The departure of his children left a quietness in the air, but it was not an empty quiet. It was a peaceful one, filled with the hum of insects in the blooming rose bushes and the soft rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze. Arthur sat on his porch step, leaning his back against the post, his hand resting on Abel's powerful shoulder. The bull's steady warmth seeped into him, a constant, living reassurance. He was home, not just in the house that was now bright with fresh paint, but within himself. He had found his footing in the world again. The days settled into a new, gentle rhythm. The visitors still came, but now they were just neighbors dropping by, part of the fabric of his daily life. David would stop by after work to share a story from the store. Gable would bring him his mail on days his arthritis was acting up. The teenage brothers had taken it upon themselves to keep his lawn mowed, refusing any payment other than a cool drink and a chance to give Abel a scratch on the nose. The fence was no longer a novelty. It was a gathering spot. In the evenings, as the sky turned from blue to shades of orange and pink, Arthur and Abel would hold court. People would lean on the fence, their workdays done, and just talk. They talked about the weather, the crops, the high school football team. They talked about their worries and their small joys. Arthur's yard had become the town's living room, a place of easy communion. Arthur realized that Abel had given him more than just companionship. He had given him back his voice. For years, he believed no one wanted to hear what he had to say. Now, people sought his perspective. He wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a bridge to it, a keeper of stories they realized were precious. In turn, they kept him connected to the present. He learned the names of their children, the struggles of their businesses, the hopes they held for the future of their small town. One evening, the vet, a young woman named Dr. Evans, who had been quietly providing Abel's care for free, came by for a checkup. She watched as a group of children read a book aloud to Abel through the fence, the bull listening with what looked uncannily like rapt attention. She turned to Arthur, her expression full of a soft wonder. "You know," she said, "in all my years of practice, I've never seen anything like him. It's not just that he's gentle, it's his presence. He heals more than just you, Arthur." Arthur looked at his friend, at the deep, calm intelligence in his dark eyes. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, illuminated by the setting sun. He saw the easy smiles, the relaxed shoulders, the sense of belonging that radiated from the small gathering. Dr. Evans was right. Abel, the rejected bull, the creature deemed worthless, was a wounded healer. And in healing Arthur's loneliness, he had shown an entire town how to heal itself. The fence wasn't a barrier to keep a monster in. It was a frame for a masterpiece of compassion. As autumn deepened, the air grew crisp, and the leaves on the trees surrounding Arthur's property turned to brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The sunsets were spectacular, painting the sky in fiery strokes that seemed to bless the little white house and its peaceful inhabitants. Arthur and Abel had their routine. They would sit together in the fading light, the old man on his porch, the bull in the grass, and watch the day come to a gentle close. It was a ritual of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the beauty they had found together. The story of Oakhaven, Arthur, and Abel continued to spread in small, quiet ways. It wasn't a sensational headline anymore. It was a modern parable, whispered from town to town, a story of hope. People would sometimes make a special trip to Oakhaven, not as tourists seeking a spectacle, but as pilgrims seeking a feeling. They would drive slowly past the house, and they would see it, an old man at peace, a magnificent animal at rest, and a fence that stood not as a sign of division, but as a testament to connection. They would leave with a little bit of that peace in their own hearts. Arthur's health, which had been in steady decline for years, stabilized. The doctor at his last checkup had been amazed. "Whatever you're doing, Arthur, keep doing it," he'd said, looking at the charts in disbelief. "Your blood pressure is down, your spirits are up. You've turned back the clock." Arthur knew the prescription wasn't a pill or a diet. It was purpose. It was love. It was a 1,000-pound friend who had shown him that it's never too late to start living again. His children did call more often, and their conversations were different now. The guilt had been replaced by a genuine interest, a respectful curiosity about his life. They visited again, and this time, they didn't just stand awkwardly in the yard. They brought their own children, Arthur's grandchildren. They watched, mesmerized, as their grandfather, a man they had known only as a sad, distant figure, introduced them to his best friend. They saw the sparkle in his eye, the strength in his voice. They were finally meeting the man he truly was, the man who had been buried under years of loneliness. One evening, as a particularly breathtaking sunset bled across the horizon, Arthur was sitting in his usual spot. Abel was beside him, his head resting on the porch, his soft breaths warming Arthur's leg. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, bathed in a soft, golden light. Arthur looked down at the great, gentle creature who had wandered into his life and refused to leave. The bull that was supposed to be a monster had become a miracle. The animal that had been rejected had become the cornerstone of a community. Arthur reached out and stroked Abel's face, his fingers tracing the outline of his soft, powerful nose. "You know, boy," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with an emotion so profound it was almost silent. "They thought we were both finished, thrown away, but they were wrong, weren't they?" Abel shifted, nudging his head into Arthur's hand, and let out a low, contented rumble. It was a sound of absolute agreement. In the quiet of that perfect evening, with the sky ablaze in a final, glorious farewell to the day, two souls the world had forgotten sat together, perfectly and completely found. They needed nothing else. They were home,